Good afternoon, my name is Marie Jones and welcome to the Taking on an Apprentice webinar. I will be your facilitator for today's presentation. Throughout the course of the webinar, you may wish to ask a question. This can be done by typing a question in the space provided in the Questions tab. Upon receiving your question, we will either respond immediately or respond at the conclusion of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the NECA YouTube webpage for later use and reference. Finally, I'd like to thank you for taking part in today's webinar, and on that note, hand you over to today's presenter, Tom Emulis.
Thanks, Marie. Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gents, NECA members. My name's Tom Emulis. I'm the General Manager at NECA Group Training. Today's presentation isn't going to be a plug for NECA Group Training, but I will mention it towards the end in the context of taking on an apprentice. Today's presentation is talking you through my experience in taking on an apprentice and all the aspects you need to consider from start to finish and the administrative issues that go around that. It comes from my experience. I've been responsible for approximately 1,800 apprentices in the last 15 years or so in my current and previous roles, and so that's been the advertising, recruitment, placement and training of those apprentices. Okay, so an overview of today's presentation. Why take on an apprentice? I presume if you're listening to this presentation you've already gone some way down the path of determining that. What's involved in recruiting, what I've learned from different approaches. Signing up, specifically the training contract and the employment contract and how they interact. What to pay an apprentice. I'll talk about the government subsidies that are available to you as an employer, about the on and off the job training and what you're required to do. I'll go through progression and completion, and then we'll also look at what you can expect it to cost you to take on an apprentice. As Marie noted, we have the opportunity to ask some questions at the end, and if you're viewing this after it's been recorded, you're also welcome to contact us at any time, and I'll try and help you out as best I can with answering your questions. So first of all, the main reasons you might consider for taking on an apprentice. It's an excellent tool for workforce planning, so securing your future. You need additional staff. One of the ways you can do that is by taking on an apprentice and building your workforce that way. You can grow your business with an apprentice as well, and they're going to be people who've learnt your skills and your clients, your environment, the way you do business, rather than perhaps bringing a qualified person in from outside who then needs to pick up those contextual skills. An apprentice is a very affordable way of growing your business and planning for the future. And I say that because it's a competency-based program, and that means that an apprentice will pick up skills and prove competent in them fairly quickly. Well, it depends on the skill, but once they are competent in a skill, then they're able to do that for you and carry out the work, and obviously they're at a lower rate than you'd have for a tradesperson, so it can be quite a productive way to deliver work. I will talk a little bit further in the presentation about the balance between using an apprentice as a productive member of your workforce and the skills that you need to ensure they obtain. It's also a good way for you to pass on your skills and experience to the next generation. Many of you as tradespeople will have been apprentices yourselves, and at some point had someone else passing on their skills, and there's a lot of reward on a personal level in passing on everything you've learnt and your experience. So recruiting, a couple of big issues here. So what are you looking for? Who are you looking for? In terms of existing knowledge and experience, you don't need to have any particular level, and people often ask me, do you need to get someone who's finished their HSC, for example, or done something else? The answer is no. There's really some base level requirements that they need to have, or you'll be wasting your time and theirs, and that's particularly on the maths and English, and I'll talk a little more in a moment about that testing. In terms of other knowledge and experience, if they've done something else in life already, even just held down a casual job, or perhaps done another trade or something like that, those kind of things that can show you they've got some practical knowledge, they're reliable and so on, are definitely an advantage. Think about the location. Whereabouts is your work? Where do you want this person to work? And obviously the closer you can draw, the closer your apprentice can be to that, the easier it's going to be for them if you end up with someone who's travelling a couple of hours each way each day to work, that's going to impact on their ability to do the job. Mobility. You can get apprentices that are quite young. Have they got a driver's licence, and do they need a driver's licence? Maybe your work sites are all near train stations, and that's fine. I put age on here deliberately. There are two different rates for apprentices under the Modern Award if you're employing them, and many of you will be employing under the award, and those are for 21 and over and those who are under 21. That is determined at the age, so that is determined on the day they commence. So if you've got two mates that are a week apart and one has just had his 21st birthday when he commences, he's on significantly more money than the other guy. The Anti-Discrimination Act actually allows you to take that into consideration and give preference to those who are eligible for the youth wages. The first year you're talking about a 45% premium for someone who is 21 or over, and second year it drops down to closer to 25 and then a little less after that. Now, having said that, in my experience, those with a few more years under their belt generally make better apprentices, but you need to be aware up front that there is that cost premium there unless you've got an agreement in place that pays people over and above that regardless of age. And I put gender on here as well, an important consideration, and look, I have heard people in industry say that this isn't a job for women. That's nonsense. We've got some very good female apprentices. There's some excellent female tradespeople out there, and to put it simply, if you're ruling out female applicants, then you're ruling out half the talent before you begin. So what works in terms of finding good applicants? Interestingly, I've done some research on the applicants that we've chosen from large pools of applicants. In other words, these are the successful people. How did they hear about us? How did they hear about the apprenticeship and so on? And the most common response I've found is word of mouth. So they know someone who's already in the industry, perhaps already in the business, or they're one of your clients, that sort of thing. So if you are looking at recruiting an apprentice, talk to your clients, talk to the friends and family and your other social contacts and people who know you or know your business, know the environment you're working in, and you may well find someone there who's suitable and interested in an apprenticeship. Beyond that, the biggest influences certainly in the metropolitan area are still parents, because most apprentices are fairly young, recent school leavers for example, and often it's the parents reading the newspaper looking for ads. So we've tried a number of different things and actually found that an ad in the paper helps. If you're looking perhaps in a particular area, you might try the local paper, which is also obviously the cheaper way to do it. We have used social media in the past, so Facebook advertisements and online through Seek. And yeah, look, some success with those. The Facebook allows you to target particular age groups or particular profiles. Seek's a little bit more hit and miss, but they're far less expensive than perhaps traditional advertising. And even having a relationship with your local schools, if you've got that opportunity, it's worth pursuing, and you may well get to some applicants that otherwise wouldn't hear about you. So let's assume at this point you've got one or more potential applicants. The next thing you really need to look at is how you're going to determine if they are a suitable applicant. And I can tell you this is the most important thing in probably everything I'll tell you today. And the reason is that about 50% of apprentices, electrical apprentices in New South Wales don't finish. And that's once you take out the NECA people, we get it closer to 90% completion, and the electrical supply industry that also has a great completion rate. The reason for that is people choose the wrong applicant in the first place. They choose someone who might be a good kid or a friend of a family or something like that, and they simply don't have the maths and English ability to get through the compulsory theory course. Now that's something that none of us can avoid. Electrical theory is not as simple as other trade theory, and it's a simple reality. Now you need to have a benchmark, and if they're not over that benchmark, you're wasting your time and theirs, and it's better to know that up front than to have them fall over at their first few exams. So how do we determine that? We use a test called the Readiness Assessment, which is now used in 6 or so of the states and territories around Australia by the other NECA businesses, as well as by a number of other businesses. It was established by the Industry Skills Council, EOS, so e-oz.com.au if you're interested in looking at it more. And they offer that as an online test, so you can get the results delivered straight away, and you can talk to them directly about what it costs to do that test, but it's in the order of $30. Once you've found someone who has that minimum literacy and numeracy level, then it's up to you, but our approach that we find works best is to have a general face-to-face interview, perhaps look at some of their past records, whether it be part-time work with references or school reports, looking for things like poor attendance and that sort of thing. But also in an interview talking to them and getting them to tell you about their experience with practical things. So perhaps, what have they done in repairing a lawnmower or a push bike or that sort of thing, and see if they understand what electricity does, how that works as well, and simple questions like how is light produced, and a good applicant will be able to talk you through a few different methods we use to produce light, whereas one who's really got no interest in electricity won't have considered that in the past. So we find things like that useful. Sometimes we also do a dexterity test, which again is really just testing that this applicant that you've got in front of you that's otherwise very good does in fact have some practical ability and has at least picked up a hand tool at some point in their life. Okay, so you've now got a good applicant. Where do we move to from here? Fortunately, there is a support network to step you through what can be a bit of a minefield of paperwork and regulatory requirements, and it's free. This all falls under the banner of the Australian Apprenticeship Support Network, and this has changed a number of times over the years. It used to be called the New Apprenticeship Centres, for example. So I think with each change of government it seems to get tweaked a bit, but the website australianapprenticeships.gov.au has and will continue to be maintained, showing you what's required. Currently in New South Wales there are 4 providers, and I think a similar number in the ACT in Queensland, and you must choose one of those to be your AASN provider. I won't give you any advice to choose one over the other. I haven't found a bad one yet, so perhaps it's just on your perception of their service level and so on, or you can simply just pick one. They will send someone out to you who will walk you through establishing the training contract, registrations. They'll answer any other information that you've got, any other questions that you've got about the process. They can talk to you about the incentives, which, as I'll note in a minute, change from time to time as well, and explain other opportunities to you. For example, right now there is it's similar to a HEC system, except it's a free loan to apprentices up to $20,000. Now, I say free, you have to pay it back, but it's indexed only at CPI, so they're not paying interest. Now, it's pretty hard to get free money in real terms anywhere these days, but knowing about that is a good option for someone who's starting the next stage of their life as an apprentice and perhaps needs a bit of money to get established. The AASN provider will also help you choose a training provider. In simple terms, that's TAFE, because we don't have private providers in most parts of New South Wales offering the Certificate 3 in systems electrician, in other words, the compulsory theory component. As I mentioned, the AASN provider is free, and the last point I've got on there is mentoring. And I make this as a note because under the AASN contract, they're also supposed to provide some mentoring for your apprentice. The dollars they've been allocated by the government to do that are hopeless, and you pretty much won't get anything there, and so I encourage you not to expect anything and to assume that the mentoring, coaching and so on will really be your responsibility as the employer. And for most of you as small businesses, that's not a problem anyway. It's what you do on a day-to-day basis. So the training contract is one of 2, I guess, legal instruments that you'll have in place between you and your apprentice. This one has 3 parties, with the third party being the training provider. It is a separate contract, so this is not their contract for employment, and it has its own obligations. So it has its own notice periods, for example, if you want to terminate it or suspend it and so on. If you want to vary it, there are different rules about what has to be done, what you can do and what has to be done through mutual consent. For example, if you want to change the training plan or move them to a new training provider, so they're moving to a different TAFE, you can do all of that, but you just have to understand your responsibilities for that. And the AASN provider can make sure you're across all of that. In fact, any changes would be done through them. It also covers your other responsibilities. So, for example, you have an obligation as the employer to ensure the apprentice gets the right experience to complete their trade. You need to make sure they've got work available and so on, and that they're available to attend the theory components. So an important part of the training contract is the training plan, which says exactly what it is that the apprentice is going to learn when and where. And you can have some input into that by working with different training providers. And what I mean by that is that the electrician's qualification has flexibility. And at one TAFE you might, for example, specialise in telecommunications, and the next one might look at programmable logic controllers or something else. So there are some options there, and that should all be documented in the training plan, which forms part of the training contract. Now the second one you've got to watch is the employment contract. This will be a lot more familiar for all of you or anyone who's got employees, and it is basically your employment contract with the apprentice. Now apprentices must be employed, they can't be casual or contractors. We do sometimes hear of people thinking, look, I'll just take them on casually for a few months and see how they are and then sign them up. That's against the Training Act, and you can get yourself into some strife if you take that approach. Now, whether you've got a collective agreement or not, so if you don't, then you're just covered by the modern award. The apprentice's benefits and conditions and obligations and so on are all spelled out in that document. And NECA can provide advice on that if you're not sure exactly what's required, or if you've got an industrial question about how to treat your apprentice. If it's a specific application, then we can help you with that as well. It covers the apprentice's rights and your obligations. An important point to note is that it interacts with the training contract, and that means that you need to satisfy the requirements of both. And in some cases one is more arduous than the other, so you can't ignore one and just follow the other. Some common pitfalls: inadequate progression. I'll talk specifically about that. So an apprentice moves from one pay grade to the next at the anniversary of their commencement, so at 1 year, 2 year and 3 years. And you're required to reimburse their costs, which I'll come to in costs, so that's their TAFE costs, but only with adequate progression. So inadequate progression, if they're failing their TAFE, or if for some other reason they haven't been able to attend their apprenticeship, then you can delay the progression, but you need to do that before it happens, and you need to stay on top of it. So a very quick example: you've got a pretty active young apprentice, plays rugby league and breaks his leg, and he might be out for a couple of months and can't do his job. So you'd want to suspend his apprenticeship during that time and let him catch up, and therefore not be automatically progressing into the next year until that time's been caught up. Now, you would do that through your AASN provider to make sure that it's all properly documented, and as I say, get on top of things like that as quickly as you can. Performance management, so where you might perhaps suspend an employee without pay for an indiscretion, that's harder to do with an apprentice because it would violate the training contract unless you've also got, approval through the Vocational Training Tribunal. So again, talk to the AASN if you need to do something like that. And to follow that to its extreme, suspension and termination also have to be dealt with separately under the employment contract and training contract. Look, they can be done, and unfortunately we do lose apprentices along the way, mostly through a mutual cancellation though, rather than through a forced termination. So what to pay your apprentice? First of all, you've got the rates of pay, which are covered in either your agreement or the modern award if you don't have an agreement. There are different rates of pay in the modern award for apprentices depending on what level of school they finished before they commenced, and obviously different rates again if they're over 21 at commencement. It also covers the allowances. Fares and travel, for example, are pretty much a daily allowance, and there are things like multi-storey allowance in there, there's a range of others, so you just need to look at what applies with your jobs. But basically it's the same ones that you have for tradespeople. So whatever you're paying your current workforce, you'll find there's a similar requirement for apprentices. You need to pay for your apprentice to attend training. So that means when he or she is at TAFE doing their compulsory theory, you're paying them to attend. In other words, you're paying their day's wage, even though they're not there working for you on the job. You need to pay for their leave, just like any other employee, and if they work overtime or shifts and so on, there's always the loadings that you would have for other employees. Just a quick note on overtime: apprentices who are under 18 can't be compelled to work overtime, so you need to ask. However, we're yet to see a 17-year-old who isn't keen to pick up as many opportunities as they can, and the extra dollars are always welcome. As employees, you have superannuation, and I mentioned previously the adequate progression. So the award requires you to reimburse an apprentice for their training costs at TAFE, so that's their TAFE attendance fee, within 6 months of it being paid. Most businesses do that by having the apprentice pay for it initially, and then at the end of the semester they present their receipts as well as their transcript that shows they've passed, and you reimburse that amount of money. We reimburse them straight away, and then obviously if they need to resit something because they've failed it, then they need to pay for that and do it in their own time to catch up. You also need to provide uniforms and PPE for apprentices. And tools as well, which I haven't put on the presentation, but there's a tool allowance for a first year apprentice in New South Wales of $450, and if you're listening to this in Queensland, it's about that much every year. So government subsidies, these are what are currently applicable. So at commencement you are paid $1,500 for taking on an apprentice, and that's paid after they've been with you for 6 months. If they leave before then you don't get the commencement subsidy. If you take on an apprentice who has left another employer in the past and is now recommencing, then you get $750, and that's only after 3 months. When an apprentice is complete and proficient, you're paid $2,500. So for a normal apprentice going from start to finish, you'll get $4,000 worth of government subsidies as the employer. Now, the completion is a fairly specific thing. It's not simply finishing the 4 years. They need to have completed the TAFE component as well, and to have had all of that signed off to the department's satisfaction so that they now have the requirements to go and get their electrical licence. This is something that people fall over with because you can easily let it slip. For example, an apprentice who gets to the end of 4 years and hasn't completed their TAFE, if they go back and complete their final capstone, which is the final TAFE exam, within 12 months there, you still should get a notification that that has occurred, and you need to respond to that notification to collect the $2,500 completion bonus, because it's still recognised that their skills on the job were gained through working with you as the employer, so you get that completion payment. It isn't automatic. The trigger for it is, and so you'll get a letter from them, but you need to fill that in and claim it. And there's quite a bit of money goes through unclaimed, which is pretty silly given that it's only a relatively easy part of the paperwork to get what's a reasonable sum of money. Your AASN provider can help you with those and make sure you don't miss any, but look, it's worth keeping your own records too. And if you've got any questions, asking sooner rather than later. There are some other subsidies and benefits available. For example, if you take on someone who is over 25 at commencement, there's another $4,000 paid 1 year into their apprenticeship, and you'll note the difference there, the discrepancy between that age and the adult apprentice wage. So over 21 gets the adult apprentice wage, but you have to be over 25 to get the $4,000 support. NECA has a position on the adult apprentice wage. We think the current discrepancy without having government subsidies there to benefit employers and address the difference is actually doing great harm. And if you've seen the recent statistics coming out from the government's own reporting agency, you'll see that rates of apprentices overall have been falling, but rates for adult apprentices have been falling at a consistently higher rate. And that's falling into line with the introduction of the adult wages at the beginning of 2014. So we'd like to see that addressed with some additional incentives to encourage people to employ people who are over 21 as apprentices. We'll continue to advocate for that, but that's the situation at the moment. There's also a number of other benefits available. For example, apprentices coming from regional areas, Indigenous backgrounds and so on. Those are mostly paid directly to the apprentice, but again, talk to the AASN provider and they will be able to give you a full list of what's available. For those businesses that are big enough to be paying payroll tax, you don't need to pay payroll tax for apprentices. And similarly, workers' compensation doesn't take into account the apprentices. So when WorkSafe is working out your payment, the number of apprentices you've got won't impact it. There is a small caveat on that. I think if you have some claims as a result of, well, claims involving an apprentice, the following year a small percentage of that is added onto your claim, but it's certainly nowhere near the full freight. It's just a few percent. Okay, so on and off the job training. So the off the job training, this is what you might traditionally call your TAFE training. I've used the term there, Registered Training Organisation. That's the official terminology for a training provider that was introduced when the vocational training system was deregulated a number of years ago. And that's because we could set up a separate training business to TAFE that delivers exactly the same training and has the same regulator and similar costs and so on. In New South Wales, there aren't very many good private training provider options at the moment for this qualification, and so I'll use the term TAFE basically from now on. They're required to deliver the training as per the training plan, and if you recall that's part of the training contract that you've signed. That includes some choice in electives. Obviously, if you insist on only going to one local TAFE and you've only got one or two apprentices, you mightn't have a lot of buying power there, but do ask, as sometimes there's flexibility even within one college. You'll find along the way that there may be some requirements for additional training. For example, if you want your apprentice to have an EWP ticket, if that isn't part of the Certificate 3 and EWP ticket isn't, then that's an additional cost that you have to wear, just as you would have to wear it for any other employee. There's cost and payment plans, and TAFE has introduced a new computer system last year, and it fell into line with the government introducing a new way that they fund vocational training. Unfortunately, the two of those changes interacting with each other caused a fair amount of chaos, and you'll get different answers from every college you talk to and potentially with different apprentices. But the long and the short of it, if I can summarise it for you, is that for full Certificate 3 apprenticeship, you're looking at about $2,000, or you are looking at $2,000 or potentially less from the TAFE. It can't be more than that, and if there are additional costs such as textbooks or something, those need to be given to you upfront before you commence the apprenticeship. So it's not enough for them to give you an invoice along the way and say, oh, and here's the textbooks and so on. They're either compulsory textbooks or they're not. If they're compulsory, you need to be notified upfront and you will have to pay them for your apprentice. If they're not compulsory, then the TAFE can't force you to pay it and the apprentice doesn't have to have them. TAFEs will allow a payment plan, although they may not offer that to you. So if you take your apprentice, send your apprentice down to the local TAFE, they're as likely to come home with a $2,000 receipt as anything else. You don't need to accept that. It's for the 4-year course, and payment plans, for example, the $2,000 spread across six monthly blocks is what we work with, and we think that that's a reasonable approach for TAFE to manage its cash flow and a business not to be putting a whole lot of risk up front through a capital payment that may be hard to recoup if things don't work out. TAFE will give you the results as the employer, and if you don't get those, chase them up. They should also let you know about attendance. So remember, you're paying for the apprentice to attend TAFE. So if they're not turning up or if they're nicking off early, that's no different to them doing that at work, and you can reduce what you're paying them as a result and follow it up with other disciplinary measures as well. So introduce yourself to the local TAFE head teacher, or at least make sure they've got your contact details, and let them know that you'd like to know when your apprentice isn't there, and perhaps get some regular reporting as well to make sure they are there. And most TAFEs are very good at this, but it won't hurt you to start that conversation early to make sure that it's not something that's going to fall between the cracks and then be messy to clean up later on. The on-the-job training is the experience they're gaining in the actual workplace. Now, people talk about an apprenticeship as what you do at TAFE. In fact, probably 80% of what they learn is what you teach them on the job. It's not what they're learning in the college. You have a requirement under the training plan to give them the necessary experience to complete their trade. There is a fair bit of flexibility in that, but there are minimum requirements for each of the compulsory skills, and if you're missing out on those, then you're not going to be able to have the apprentice complete their trade while working for you. Now, what I mean there is, I'll give you a quick example. If you're a specialist in data, for example, and that's all you do, your apprentice might be a gun in installing data, but they're not going to be able to complete their trade because they haven't picked up the right mix of commercial, industrial, and the wiring experience that they need. Now, all of that is documented through tracking systems. You may have heard of Skills Tracker or e-profiling. Your training provider will help tee those up for you. And those systems verify the amount of time an apprentice has spent on each of the different tasks, and they form the evidence that's required to show they've completed the necessary on-the-job requirements. So a consideration for you there is that if you pick up a job that is a little more unusual for you, it may be good to get the apprentice involved in that fairly quickly because the opportunity might come up again to give them that skill. And this ties back to my comment earlier about productivity. It can be tempting to leave an apprentice on something that they're doing very well, but you need to balance that with the requirement to give them all the experience they require, and that may mean taking them off something they're doing well and getting them to start again with a new skill so that they complete the full requirements. Now, progression and completion. So you'll hear the terms time-based and competency-based, and there's a lot of noise around those. In essence, the time-based is simply a 4-year apprenticeship moving up every year, and competency-based is saying, well, we recognise that people learn at different rates, so how about we have something other than time-based? The risk with competency-based is that if you don't have a very robust and thorough method of determining when someone has acquired the right set of skills, then it's open to abuse, and you'll end up with providers pushing for 2.5-year or even 18-month long apprenticeships. So NECA's position is that we support competency-based training, but we do not support competency-based wage progression. So the current award and our position also is that apprentices progress at their 12-month anniversary. However, in their 4th year, if they have been able to complete their capstone and they've finished enough of all the on-the-job requirements, it is possible for them to complete early. Conversely, some apprentices will go into their 5th year before they're fully competent in the full range of tasks they need. I've mentioned suspension before, so again, if somebody is unable to attend work for whatever reason, whether it be their own expertise on the job or more often something that's happened separate to work, you can suspend and therefore extend their apprenticeship at the end. If things go really wrong, you may have to look at termination. Now, first of all, there's a probation period. The default in the award is 3 months. Some agreements, including our own, allows us to extend that to 6 months, which is the maximum allowable under the Training Act. Now, within a probation period, it's quite easy to terminate if you need to. Beyond that, you need to go through a few steps. So most commonly, mutual termination is the outcome. So that's where both you and the apprentice say, hey, this isn't working out, and they're happy to sign that and move on with life. Abandonment also happens, so someone simply disappears, as can happen with an employee. Forced termination is a little more difficult because you must satisfy the requirements of both the training contract and the employment contract. And from the perspective of the training contract, that will probably mean a trip down to the Vocational Training Tribunal, and there's delays associated with scheduling that and so on. Your support network can give you advice on that if you need to, but they will tell you that the best way to do it is to come to some terms that will result in mutual termination. Completion of an apprenticeship in New South Wales is triggered by completing the capstone. That's your final exam at TAFE, which is really an all-encompassing test that they've understood all of the theory, and that gets them their Certificate 3, and also completing the on-the-job requirements. Now in New South Wales there's currently a thing called a craft certificate that is obtained when you've spent 4 years on the job and you've gained enough experience. It's actually not really worth the paper it's written on, because to get a licence you've got to separately establish the experience that you've gained and have the capstone. The craft certificate doesn't exist in other jurisdictions, and anyone considering taking on an apprentice now will almost certainly find that by the time your apprentice is completing their trade, these requirements will have changed in New South Wales. So I'll talk briefly about NECA's view on that, and that is that the systems used in other states such as Victoria, WA and the ACT are superior, where they actually have independent checking to ensure that people have in fact gained the right experience before they allow them to get the licence. There's a few different ways of doing that, and as I say, I expect that will evolve into new policy in New South Wales in the coming years. And that NECA's position is held because there have been some well-documented cases of it going wrong, where people have obtained a licence without having the right experience, and that's led to adverse outcomes down the track, including a recent one in Queensland that resulted in the fatality of another apprentice. So the support network provider will tell you more about the requirements there, but as it stands now, I guess that in simple terms, if you plan to get your apprentice all the right experience they need on the job, and you help them make sure they get through their TAFE, then that's going to be, one way or another, that's going to lead to the licensed outcome at the end. Now, how to work out what it's going to cost. When I send out the rates that we use for group training to charge out an apprentice, I often get a reaction like, well, you know, the first year is $12.36 under the award and you're $20. Why is that? The simple answer is that a first year apprentice is only available to you for productive labour for, well, it can be a minimum of 177 days. And that's because you take out their TAFE days, their annual leave, their sick leave, and so on. And then you add into that the additional costs. So it's not just their wages and super and allowances, but you're paying for their leave, with leave loading, you've got their TAFE costs, uniforms, PPE, and if you want to, you can even consider the a loss in productivity from your own staff in supervising the apprentice. If you put in just those other fixed costs and divide it by the 177, you'll arrive pretty close at the rate we charge out at, and that's because we're a not-for-profit and have a few other advantages by being a registered charity and so on. As I mentioned before, you'll still have to consider overtime and shifts. Workers' compensation is one that is essentially no cost to you. And then when you're working out how to charge an apprentice on the job, think about that. How many days are they on the job per year? What is their relative productivity? And that's a very subjective thing, and it may depend on your individual apprentice and the tasks that they're doing and the stage they're at. But consider all of those things there, you can work it out. You've also got to consider the quiet period. So as an employee, simply because you don't have any work for the next month doesn't mean you can't pay them. So that's one of the issues you've got to take into account too. If you can't be sure of your work, then you need to be pricing in some risk for that. So I said I wouldn't do a big plug for NECA group training. I'm going to finish with just a very quick summary here on what we do. And the reason I'm doing that is that if in listening to all of these issues with taking on apprentices, you've found one that's a showstopper for you, then I'd put it forward that we're a pretty good alternative way of getting apprentices into your business. For example, if you specialise in a type of work and that means you simply won't have the variety of work, then a directly employed apprentice is going to run into problems, and you're either going to have to lend them to another business that has the work they need, or they're going to fall over in terms of meeting their requirements. Similarly, if you don't want the risk of recruitment and potentially taking on someone who doesn't fit in with your business and then having difficulty in getting rid of them, or if you don't know for sure, if you're worried about the workload down the track, then group training works by us being the employer, taking on all of the risk and then sending you an apprentice, and you only pay for the time that you are using an apprentice. We don't like to operate as a labour hire agency, so we're looking for longer term placements, but if you've got a 3 or a 6 month or longer project coming up and you need some extra help, talk to us and we can get you an apprentice or several apprentices who will do that job. When work's quietening down, you can let us know and send them back, and we'll send them somewhere else. And similarly, if you've got someone that you want to employ but you don't have the variety of work, you can employ them through us. We'll put them back to you so they learn most of what they need to learn with you, and then go out to other businesses to pick up the gaps and then come back to you as a qualified tradesperson. As I said, we have close to 90% completion rate, and over 90% of those who complete are then employed by the businesses who have been training them. And we're also happy to be flexible with things like letting you be involved in recruitment if you'd like to have a say in which apprentices are coming to work with you. So if you want to know more about that, get in touch with me. We can give you a cost there, and you'll see that once you do the sums yourself, it's pretty much cost neutral with us taking on all the risk. And that's because we're a not-for-profit, so there's no other incentive for us other than to provide quality tradespeople to the industry. So by way of summary, thank you for sitting with me through this presentation. We've touched on why you would take on an apprentice, what you should consider in recruiting and what we know has worked from our experience. I've talked through signing up, in particular the training contract and how you can get help with that, how it interacts with your employment contract. We've looked at what you should pay an apprentice and how the government helps subsidise that. We've looked at the fairly complex issue of what requirements you have for on and off the job training, but particularly you as the employer for the on the job training, how we measure progression and completion, how you might consider the costs of taking on Apprentice, and of course finally the alternative if there's some showstoppers for you in the above. So look, in summary, to finish off, I'd thank you for listening in. Please don't hesitate to send through some questions, and if you can take on an apprentice either through us or directly, then I strongly encourage you to do that. It's the future of our industry, and training is a very rewarding process both for the person who's learning and for the person who's providing the training. So thank you and good afternoon.